In 1875, in wake of the Southern Plains Indian Wars, Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt led a large group of Native Americans, soon to be prisoners, from freedom in the plains to the abysmal conditions at Fort Marion, a prison, school, and Reformation center in St. Augustine, Florida. During the era of the Manifest Destiny, relations between whites and Indians was disastrous, and tribes put up great resistance to reservation life. The government used the Fort Marion prisoners as an example and warning against misconduct from other tribes. The group of prisoners represented the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, and Caddo tribes, and even included 2 women and a child. Pratt described them as the men who had been the terror of our settlers, who had done many a deed of savage cruelty and blood. An appendix listing the prisoners and their crimes included a variety of offenses, from petty theft to murder. However, many of the prisoners are merely described as bad men and were imprisoned without a trial simply because they behaved as their culture dictated. Upon arrival to the prison, the Indians were forced to cut their hair and wear military uniforms. Pratt wanted to gain the prisoners' trust by befriending them. He formed a military squad of 50 prisoners, equipped them with old guns, and gave them the responsibility of patrolling one another. He removed the inmates' shackles and allowed them to exercise in the fresh air, offering escape from their overheated, dingy cells. He even allowed them to camp on nearby Anastasia Island for up to 2 weeks at a time. However, there is much evidence indicating that Pratt exploited the prisoners. Fort Marion became a tourist attraction. Twice weekly, the prisoners performed public dances and held mock events, such as buffalo hunts and powwows, for both Florida locals and visitors. During the 18th century, phrenology, the study of the shape of the skull, and craniometry, measurement of the skull, were popular scientific methods to determine differences between humans and other species, and especially differences between humans themselves. Thus, the 18th century saw a great movement in attempting to define racial types by making character inferences from physical characteristics. In his book Crania Americana, American physician Samuel George Morton described the physical characteristics of the Native Americans. He wrote that the race is marked by a brown complexion, long, black, lank hair, the eyes are black and deep set, the brow low, the cheekbones high, the skull is small. In their mental character, the Americans are averse to cultivation and slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war. Correspondence began between Frederick Ward Putnam, second director of the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and Spencer Fullerton Baird, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution from 1878 to 1887. The men were interested in having casts with vital expressions. In particular cases, they desired full body casts so that the Native American race could be better studied. In a letter to Putnam, Baird wrote, "Of course the acquisition of the heads in alcohol is desirable, but we cannot conveniently chop off those of the Indian squad. I do not see how a photograph of a certain Indian can be half as valuable as a cast of his entire head and neck." They commissioned sculptor Clark Mills to go to St. Augustine to make plaster cast busts of these prisoners. Mills himself had a great interest in phrenology. He was a house plasterer who one day skeptically had his head examined by a phrenologist. The phrenologist encouraged him to cultivate his hidden talent of sculpture, a thought that haunted Mills, until one day he learned how to mold plaster from an Italian sculptor. Mills' friends and family marveled at his talent, and he was soon commissioned to make the equestrian statue of Jackson. Pratt describes the process of making the life casts. The subject was seated in a chair, and a large muslin sheet tucked in about his neck to protect his clothing. A flexible cap, fitting close, protected the hair. A preparation of plaster which hardened quickly was built over the head, the neck, then the ears and the face. Breathing was accomplished through apertures to the nostrils. When the material hardened, it was carefully broken, removed, and piece by piece built back into form. When this was completed, it became a perfect mold. A material which prevented the plaster from sticking was put over the inside, and then a plaster mixture poured within this and rolled around until it was made sufficiently thick for shipment. When this hardened, the mold was broken off and an exact head of each subject produced. Many of the prisoners were skeptical, even fearful of undergoing the process. Pratt described the Native Americans as having a rooted aversion to the process required, and indeed a superstitious fear generally of being imitated in any manner, even by the pencil or camera. It wasn't until Pratt himself agreed to participate that the Indians felt relief. In his memoirs, however, Pratt later described the enthusiasm generated for the project after the prisoners learned that their casts would be displayed in Washington, D.C. Today, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History still holds some of the original plaster head casts, molds, and busts. According to Dr. David Hunt, collections manager of the Division of Physical Anthropology at the museum, some of these casts and faces have been used in exhibits in past years. At the Peabody, however, the casts remain shelved out of public view, raising the question, is it proper to hide from the public this gruesome exploitation of Native Americans, or is it further exploitation to display the life casts? If they are not to be displayed, should the life casts be returned? Harvard University has been in full compliance of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in November 1990, which requires federal agencies and federally funded institutions to return Native American cultural items to their respective descendants. The act includes human remains and funerary or sacred objects. In the case of the life casts, it does not apply. Jimmy Arterberry, a Comanche scholar, NAGPRA official, and tribal historic preservation officer, believes that if the casts are to be exhibited or studied, consultations must occur with the tribes of each individual whose caste is in question. While unhappy with the lack of communication between museums and tribes, he is hopeful that better cooperation will benefit both the institutions and the communities. Many of the descendants have never seen images of their ancestors and were unaware until recently that the life casts even existed. Bobby Gonzalez, NAGPRA coordinator for the Caddo tribe of Oklahoma, disagrees with Arterberry's view that families will be open to cooperation. He believes that an exhibit would be tasteless. In support of this view, John Sipe, a Northern Cheyenne chief and historian and Fort Marion descendant, reminds us that Native American culture is sensitive to human representation. While separating the life casts would cause them to lose their eerie impact on their viewers, sensitivity toward the subject's families and culture is of utmost importance. Given that the life casts are currently neither viewed nor studied, perhaps it is best to return them to their descendants. Regardless of the future of the life casts, it is our responsibility to be educated and never attempt to hide the injustice that was done to the Fort Marion prisoners.